Hello and welcome to Geeky Week. This is week 4 of our online book club, reading the final document of the Synod Assembly Together. I'm Avril Baigent, one of the co-founders of the School for Synodality, a project designed to help the Church rise to the challenge of becoming a more listening and discerning missionary community. Last week, I was joined by Dr. Estella Padilla, who spoke about the conversion of processes. How do we all the baptized, not just all those who go to church, discern the Lord together? We've had a lot of feedback telling us how inspirational Estella was and how many people wanted to watch it more than once because it was so rich. If you missed it, you can find it on our YouTube channel or on the webinar page of our website. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Cathy Clifford. Cathy is based at St Paul's University in Ottawa, so shout out to all the Canadians we regularly have on with us. She's a world-leading voice on the Second Vatican Council, ecumenism and church structures and processes, with a particular emphasis on the understanding of conversion and renewal of the churches and development of doctrines. She was a delegate to the Rome Synod Assembly and served as an elected member of the 2024 Synod on Synodality's drafting commission for the final document. So she was one of those people who was actually involved in the real detailed writing and rewriting and writing again of the document. So she's been closer to the text than nearly anyone. Tonight we'll be discussing part 4 of the final document, the conversion of bonds. And this is the second and the last, I promise you, the last of our pre-recorded interviews. Cathy is so in demand that even when she was speaking to me at 8 a.m. in the morning, she was on her second meeting of the day. So we're hugely grateful to her for fitting us in and guiding us through this tricky chapter. After the input, we'll open for questions. And like last week, I'll be joined live by Father Matthew Nunes. And as we know, Father Matthew was one of the co-moderators of the Liverpool Synod and has a lot of experience in synodality and synodal structures here in the UK. So if you're watching this live, please do use the chat to say hello and to share thoughts with us. And we always love hearing in from everybody. But we know that some people find the chat distracting, so you can switch it off at any time by clicking the X button on the top right hand side of the chat panel. So hopefully that keeps everybody happy. So before we begin and dive into our conversation with Cathy, we just want to have a moment of prayer. Just remembering that lots of us are watching this and encountering this in the midst of much going on in our lives. So, Lord Jesus, we give this time to you now. We put down everything we are carrying with us. We put down all our worries and concerns and hand them over to you, that you might make this a blessed time, and a blessed time for our community, watching and listening together live and at different times, but also the community worldwide of all who are passionate for our church. So we ask that you send your Holy Spirit powerfully on us as we gather tonight. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Cathy, thank you so much for joining us. And I have to say that it's 8 o'clock in the morning. You're in Ottawa. I'm in the UK. So we're pre-recording this so that we can then put this out in our usual slot. But I'm just so thrilled that you're here with us today. This is, I think, the trickiest chapter of this document. And in fact, in the office, this is being called the Geeky Week because we feel that you need somebody who really understands Vatican structures in order to help us with this. There's a beautiful bit about the parish at the beginning of it, and then it delves into levels of possibly Dan Brownish levels of obscurity and things. So we're really delighted that you're going to help us out with this week. So let's just start off though, because you have been an assembly delegate. You've been working on synodality. Tell us about your experiences of synodality.
So, I mean, I think like most other people in the church, my first experience in practice was in the parish consultation process. And I did some work with the Canadian Conference of Bishops in the later stages of preparing their report. And then I was nominated as a delegate to be present in Rome for the 2 meetings of the Synod. I was also invited because I'm teach theology and ecclesiology um, uh, and ecumenism. I was invited to do some consulting between the two assemblies. So there was some work that was done um, around the working document for the synod delegates, and it created teams of consultors and invited us to give a bit of input on the ecumenical questions and on some ecclesiological questions. And then I was also a panelist at a theological forum during the synod. And I was the first lay person nominated or elected by the North American delegation to sit on the commission for the redaction of the final document. So um, I was pretty exhausted after all that. But I had it was a great sort of bird's eye view of how that final document got put together and going through the whole process at every level.
It's a bit classic, find a busy person and then give them about 3 times more work to do. But
Right. But I should also say, I mean, to me, this is quite fascinating because I teach ecclesiology and I work in ecumenical work. I'm a member of the Methodist Catholic International Commission. But the question of synodality has been discussed by theologians for over half a century, or really since the Second Vatican Council. This has been a very lively topic, and it's a very important um, notion of or a fundamental understanding of what it is to be church that has been the object of theological discussion in ecumenical, informal ecumenical dialogues. And other churches, I don't think we would be looking at this within the Catholic Church if other churches hadn't also kind of said, like, all the churches recognize they need to reform and improve their governing structures and practices. But here's a weak point in Catholicism. You know, everything's been sort of monarchical, pyramidal, and you're forgetting the people. You're forgetting the community. And there's a long, long tradition. We see it in the New Testament. We see it in the life of the early church, that the whole community has a role to play and contributes to the work of discernment and deliberation and decision making in the practice of the church. And we need to refine that balance, and that's what we're trying to do today. So, and this is really important for what the unity of the church might look like going forward.
and we should just say that ecclesiologists are a particular kind of theologians that deal with models of the church or ways of being church. Would that be right?
Yes, and structures and how structures work. So yeah, I'm part of that geeky bunch that can read the fourth part of the final document and say, oh yes, oh I know what they're talking about. Because what that fourth section of the document does is it goes through every level of church life in all the, if you want, the structuring or organization of relationships, beginning from the parish to the diocese to the conference of bishops to other continental groups of conferences of bishops, the role of the Eastern Catholic churches and their patriarchs and major archbishops, and then the Bishop of Rome. That's a huge configuration or series of relationships. Yeah.
Mm. And I think probably for most Catholics, I mean, really, I've worked in the church all my life until I went to Rome earlier this year. There was big scads of this that I didn't really think very much about. Most Catholics know about parishes and dioceses and then the Pope. And actually,
Yes.
what you find in this document is, and of course, what any global institution would have to have would be ways of managing these structures in local and continental and then in universal ways. So that's really what we're going to be unpacking tonight. Can you tell us why is this important? Just before we dive right in, why do we need to pay attention to these kind of structures, and why is it important for the kind of renewal of the synodal church?
So this section heading talks about this being a conversion of bonds, and I've just used the word relationships. The if in a sense, the most theological term we could use to describe the nature of those relationships is communion.
Mm,
This is about structures of communion. What holds the church together? Um, we don't, as Christians, uh, and Pope Francis recalled this in some of his teaching, and he was really drawing our attention to something the Second Vatican Council saw is that we are not, as Christians, saved alone. No Christian is alone, but when we experience the love of God and accept, and profess our faith in Jesus Christ, this changes our relationship with everybody. It's not just a me and Jesus moment. This changes my relationship with everybody.
mm,
And it puts me in a community where I haven't chosen these people, but the church is the people who've been all experienced this conversion in our relationship with God, but it changes our relationships with all other people. And it's what puts us in the community that we call the church. And so we do have to have some order and structuring in those relationships. And that's how all these different bodies come about. So the church itself is a series or a communion of communions.
mm.
So each local church is a communion of people. And this local church, my diocese in Ottawa, is in communion with the Archdiocese of London or Westminster, and Tokyo, and Lima, Peru, um, by virtue of our faith. And we recognize in each other a common faith. And the role of the Bishop of Rome is to have oversight over all those bonds of communion.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. And it's funny because I think we often, if we travel, you tip up, you look it up. Where's the nearest Catholic church? And you just go to the nearest Catholic church. And almost we experience the global church perhaps from that very simple way that wherever you are, more than likely, there's a church not that far, or that you might be able to experience, a Catholic community that you might be able to experience. But actually, I don't think many people have really thought about, how does that happen? How is it that there is a church, and how is it structured and how does it come together? So that's really helpful. So shall we start at the parish level then? Because you've helpfully kind of given us that overview. What is particular about this vision of parish that we find in this document? I have to say, I love the description of parish that we get here. It's quite exciting.
Yeah, so I mean, probably this might be part of your experience, but when I was a kid, you went to the church in your neighborhood, and the parish church was a hub of a neighborhood community. And there might be a school in that neighborhood. It might be attached to the parish church. That's gone.
Mm,
Like there's been we're in the midst of a huge cultural shift. And this is not just a change in the way we experience relationships and the experience of belonging in the church, but it's part of the world that young people are navigating in our culture. We don't belong in the same way that we used to communities. Um, we probably travel much more easily. And where I live, most people are prepared to travel across town to go to a parish where they have more in common with, or like the style of the liturgy, or they like the social justice commitment of this community, or they go to belong to an ethnic parish in some other part of town. So they're not neighborhood communities anymore. And so there's a sense in which there's a reflection in this section on our changing relationship to place. We originally, the parish and the diocese were defined as occupying a territory. So if you lived within a certain geographical boundary, that defined your parish affiliation. Well, that's not the way people define their relationships anymore, the parish communities. And on a larger scale, I'm going to move beyond the parish here, but a particular case that is raised in section 4 of the final document is the experience of Eastern Catholic churches. So by way of example, since when the war broke out in Ukraine, Canada received 800,000 Ukrainian refugees who are here on temporary status. Many of them will stay. They already had family connections here. But we've just absorbed this enormous community of Ukrainians, many of whom are Catholic.
Mm.
And this is part of what's been happening in Eastern Catholic churches globally for the last at least a half century, so that today there are more Melkites in Brazil than there are in Lebanon, where their patriarch lives. And the patriarch of Kiev, who's the pastor to all these Ukrainians who are in Canada, um, these we always had an accommodation in Latin territories for the presence of small diaspora groups of Eastern Catholics. Well, that's changed radically. And the Eastern Catholic patriarchs and the heads of those churches are saying, we need to rethink the structures we have because we need more, this is a technical word, jurisdiction for the patriarch to intervene more directly in what goes on in those churches in the so-called diaspora, because now the majority of Eastern Catholics live outside the originating territory of their Eastern Catholic tradition. So that's a set of relationships that's identified in this document also.
Yes, I had on one of my tables when we were at the assembly, had a wonderful Eastern Rite deacon from northern Syria, and he was talking about the fact that the Syrian church is not in Syria, and it's
Yes.
spread across the world, and
Yeah.
so how does that function?
Yeah.
Um, so I think what you're giving us a sense of there, Cathy, is how does the church keep on sort of not get unruly with this rapidly changing world, with these rapidly changing patterns of migration?
Right.
We spoke about on our table the fact that when the economy collapsed in Sri Lanka, that many Catholics came into Colombo, and then now I've got Sri Lankan Catholics in my parish in the southeast of England, and just this movement. So if a parish isn't a geographical entity, what is the vision of it then that we get in this in the document?
I think it's hard to say how we define a parish now.
Mm,
I mean, it's certainly an intentional community.
mm,
Um, and I do think that every parish community, though, must have a relationship to its immediate neighborhood.
mm,
And this is especially in urban communities, there's a sense sometimes of a kind of anonymity in larger parish communities that we want to overcome because we want our parishes to be places of welcome and also places of mission.
mm,
And this is again, I ask my own parish community to think about what is the mission of our parish community in this neighborhood? Where are the where are we being called to serve? We may not have, the right match of gifts, but there are people in need. And one of my fellow parishioners said at one of these meetings, "Oh, but we live in a very like middle class neighborhood. There's no poor people here." And I said, "Well, how are you defining poverty?"
mm,
There's a lot of elderly, isolated people. There's a lot of students who have lots of economic needs and needs for community. And so how can we as a parish community be responsive to the needs and understand that we don't exist, no Christian community exists for itself, and that we have a mission. That's a
mm.
hard thing to get into our mind.
There's a lovely description. It just in 115 as reflecting on the church's home. And there's a lovely place about thinking about welcome, hospitality, and inclusion. What would it be like if we thought of our parishes as home? not just
Yes.
for ourselves, but everybody who is living around. What would that be like?
Yeah. So again, I mean, there's some of what I experienced in my youth of the parish being a hub, a
Mm,
neighborhood meeting place. Um, some of that might be attenuated today in our experience, but we can ask ourselves, how do we revive that? How do we, um, you know, we have these huge spaces where we
mm,
gather for 1 week, 1 hour every week. So how can those spaces also be put at the disposition of the neighborhood community and its needs? And how do we work so that our parish becomes a place of genuine encounter and welcome?
mm. So then, sort of moving up from that kind of parish structure, there's this phrase, the exchange of gifts, which we get a lot in this chapter. And actually, Estella spoke about it last week, but she took that phrase and applied it on a sort of interpersonal, that there's an exchange of gifts between ourselves. Can you just unpack it a bit more? Because it's used in a few different ways, isn't it, in this chapter?
Yeah, I think there's a vision here of how there's an invitation to us to pay attention to what's going on in other local churches, to say, my diocese, my National Conference of Bishops is dealing with a set of issues given our own uh, particular context. But we can and should be open to learn from and receive from the lived experience of of Christians elsewhere.
Mm,
And this idea of the exchange of gifts is language that's used in actually, frankly, it's been used in ecumenical dialogues for a while to say we can learn from other churches.
mm,
They have gifts. The Spirit is doing interesting things in the lives of other churches that can teach us a few things. And we have a few things too that we want to offer. So, but one of the things Francis did early in his pontificate that was very striking at the time, but I think we stopped noticing when he started writing his first pastoral letters. He would quote statements that were made by different conferences of bishops around the world. And so he was effectively saying, well, the lived experience of the church in Latin America had led a group of bishops to take this position, to say this. So, or in Africa, or in Asia, or in Europe, or in the Middle East. So that he's not just teaching from the top down out to the local churches, but he's trying to harvest the gifts
mm.
from the different local churches and say, we can receive this experience and wisdom because there's something there that the whole church can benefit from, and I think that the synod document tries to capture some of that dynamic here.
As you're talking, actually, what came into my mind just then was the process of the conversation in the spirit, where as you went around the table, you would hear from, I mean, in the Rome Assembly, you'd hear from a Japanese laywoman in a mission community, you'd listen to an archbishop from Africa, you'd listen to a head of a Vatican dicastery, and everybody had those different perspectives, that exchange of gifts around the table. And actually, just imagining that on a global basis, that the conversation, the learning, the sharing is going on because it is almost as if we think maybe in the UK, like we're all good. Or our troubles are our own. We can't really learn from anywhere else. And I think one of the things I most appreciated about being able to be part of the assembly was that sense of um, you know the global church. Quite often, people have been to a World Youth Day or a gathering in St. Peter's. You see the flags, but actually, just the lived experience, the different ways of being Catholic around
Yeah,
the world, and how we can share that with each other.
but this is the heart of what Catholicity means, that there's room for this diversity of gifts in the communion of the church. And so the other experience I had at these tables at the synod was to say, okay, well, let's talk about um, what it means to have a conversation in the spirit, or let's talk about what kind of ministries we need in our local church. Um, lay ministries, ministries of the word, the ministry of the catechist. Um, and the more we talked, I thought, well, of course, there's a place for a diversity of ministries, but it's pretty clear that already this is not being lived out uniformly. And that's as it should be.
Mm.
So that different local churches are developing different ministries to meet their particular pastoral needs, and that's just that's fine. We need ways of recognizing those charisms and those gifts. We need to have them properly integrated into the life of a local church, in the structuring of a local diocese, but we also have to be prepared to acknowledge it will not be uniformly structured in every cultural context.
Mm. And there's that, we get that sense of the sharing of gifts even between churches with economic disparity, don't we? And that shouldn't just be one way.
Yes.
Um, and also, I mean, you've already spoken about this sort of ecumenism, the sharing of gifts across different denominations as well.
Yes, and again, I think we experienced that through the presence of fraternal delegates
Mm.
who contributed very thoughtfully to our discussions, and and who are themselves very interested by what we're learning and experimenting with in the Catholic Church, because their own churches are facing similar challenges and tensions in the way their churches are governed. And what part of what we're trying to work out also is goes back to how do we structure our relationships of communion, recognizing that the we haven't got yet to the what the document says about the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, but it takes up another theme from Pope Francis' pontificate that says we need more decentralization. This is a kind of um, coded language to say local churches need more autonomy
Mm.
and more freedom to adapt, to be more responsive to the specific needs in their culture and their ecclesial context. And so there's a tension between that kind of diversity and how we hold together in communion. And and it's pretty clear. Again, Francis, I think captured this very starkly in his early stages of his papacy when he said, "You can't expect to look to the Bishop of Rome to have answers for every question." And that the pastors of the local churches are closer to their people and they know better how to respond to those needs. So this is part of this holding together in tension, um, these relationships. But every global Christian communion is experiencing these tensions and asking, how do we allow for this kind of diversity and adaptation and still hold together in communion? What kind of structures and practices do we need to enable the churches to take root in the diversity of cultures, but still hold together in communion so we can still recognize in each other a common faith?
Mhm. And I mean, that is such an interesting, it's a tension that the church has dealt with for 2000 years, isn't it? What
Yeah.
what holds us together, and how do we react to the needs of the changing world, and how do we remain recognizably Catholic while, I mean, anybody would know that you surely wouldn't be seeing the kind of Catholicism we have right now in the fourth century. There's a trajectory but it's not really a straight
You could
line.
go right to the New Testament and see a great deal of diversity. The church in Corinth is not identical with the church in Jerusalem, and it's not identical with the church in Rome and Antioch. So that's ingrained. That kind of Catholicity is built into who we are as church. But these are the tensions that we need to work out. And again, we're asking then how do we hold together as a reconciled church? If we're trying to rebuild the unity between different Christian denominations. The questions, we're experiencing them both internally in each global Christian family and then between the churches. And we're asking, how do we structure, how can we reimagine the communion between the divided churches? Can we come to enough agreement so that we can find ways of making decisions together,
Mm.
and not taking away from the particular identities of the various Christian confessions? How do they, how are we all being, in a sense, renewed and converted and becoming more fully church, so that we come to a point where we can live together in communion, in full communion again?
Mm. And even, I mean, I'm smiling as I'm listening to you talk because I'm also thinking about parishes. How even do we do this in a microcosm where some people would like to change it? And even I don't think it's generational so much to say that it's the younger people who want to change and the older people who want to keep things the same. You can't assume that anymore. But how do we, even as a community, um, accommodate those different tensions and different speeds and different ways of being community in difference together? It's very interesting. So, I mean, Cathy, one of the big issues I kind of blew up at the assembly, it blew up outside as well, was this notion of how much change can the local bishops have, and the notion of that some decisions, as Pope Francis said, will have to be made somewhere else. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because there was a moment it felt like in the hall that we were about to say that anything could be decided by any group of people anywhere, and then it all, which was not on the table at all, but it all kind of had to be brought back again.
Yeah. So this was around the question of the role of the conferences of bishops. And there's a large section in several paragraphs in section 4 that talk about the need to re-examine the role of conferences of bishops and the need to evaluate their effectiveness. I think we're coming through a period where the conferences of bishops, for over 25 years now, it's been assumed that they have no authority.
Mm.
It was, and Francis has tried to open up this question and again and said, can a conference of bishops teach with authority? I would ask, can a group of bishops seriously deliberate about a matter and seek to proclaim the gospel in response to a challenging question and not have authority?
Mm.
But we've had these are here's the geeky part of my métier here. We've had these conversations in among theologians about the role of the universal church governed by the Bishop of Rome and the role of the local churches. And we have a conception of the collegiality of bishops that unfortunately said the College of Bishops can act only as a whole and not groups, you know, so that we sort of demoted the role of the conferences of bishops. Frankly, Rome was afraid of some of the prophetic stances that had been taken by some of the conferences of bishops through the 1980s and early 90s and tried to put a lid on this. And so we're trying to open up this question again and say they bishops have to have more autonomy and more freedom. And they also, just like we're saying in a parish community, that decisions should be taken collectively, and a pastor should not go against the common mind of a community on an important matter that affects the whole community. Now I think that's where the real rubber hits the road and where the tough part is going to be in implementing all of this.
Mm.
Um, but but this extends to the Conference of Bishops because for again a generation of bishops have gone to meetings of the Conference of Bishops. They do studies, they reflect, they deliberate together, they make a decision. The bishops go home, and nobody feels bound by the decision that was just made. And so, what we want is to understand the weight of that deliberative process, that when we belong to a communion, when these relationships are an expression of our common faith, then we should feel bound by the common mind of a community, of the common mind of a body. And so the bishops also do speak, not with the authority of the whole church. They're not defining. This is the fear that the tension we experienced in the synod discussions, is that we're allowing conferences of bishops to create new doctrine. That's not what we're talking about at all.
Mm.
But the bishops are the authoritative interpreters of doctrine for the people in their local churches. And their hands have kind of been tied for a while, and we want to see this loosened up.
One of the really interesting moments that I think around our table and maybe in the hall more generally was in response to polygamy, where actually a lot of people who were getting very worried about what might Bishops' Conference run amok and do. I would love to think what they were imagining at that point. Actually, it was so interesting. But the notion of, well, really, would it be right for the rest of the church to make a decision about polygamy when it isn't our experience? Surely that has to be the African bishops that wrestle with that within
Yes,
some pretty solid church teaching, isn't there?
yeah, and they have to find the appropriate pastoral response to the people in their context. Absolutely.
I think that, hopefully that just helps people to see the kind of thing that, was being thought about, but lots of different responses and lots of different economic situations, political situations, all sorts of things arising. Let's talk about the Pope then. So in all of this, and you've been referencing Pope Francis throughout. How is this the role of the Pope in a synodal church, adapting, changing, renewing, and how do you see that going forward?
So I think it's important to think about the synod itself and think about conferences of bishops. These are new structures. We've been experimenting with these realities since the Second Vatican Council. Excuse me. And these are structures that were established to express and give a form to the recovery of the understanding of the collegial nature of the authority of bishops. And the bishops of Rome also are obliged to govern the church in a collegial way. The Pope is the Pope because he's a bishop, and because he's a bishop of the Church of Rome, which historically was an exemplary church. It's the church of the martyrs, Peter and Paul, and a church to which others churches would appeal for assistance when they were experiencing tensions. Um, and so it's evolved, of course, into a very different reality. So the 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 Pope Paul VI established the Synod of Bishops at the end of the Second Vatican Council. And he said, as a way of carrying forward and continuing the council, because he said, this meeting, the Second Vatican Council, which is a big synod, it's a synod of the global church. Um, I've benefited from the wisdom and the advice of the bishops from around the world who have a lot to say about the important questions and challenges that the church needs to face. And in a sense, I'm at your service also. We have to we have to look for answers to these things together. And so the synods have met regularly. This is changing the style in which the bishops of Rome govern the church. And uh, I think that the synod itself in this iteration was broadened out to include, in a very intentional way, the participation of the whole people of God, because the bishops are present in this body as representatives of local churches. And so Francis has rightly said don't come to a synod in Rome without consulting your people first.
Mm.
Because what we're trying to discern is what is the mind of the whole church. The faith, the gospel is born not just by ordained ministers, but it's received by every baptized Christian. And we're all called to discern what the demands of the gospel are. And what the bishops and the Bishop of Rome teach is the faith of the whole church, not their personal opinions. That's a hard thing for us to get over. We think of the Pope since the First Vatican Council as a kind of oracle, like he has a special challenge to God and can come up with answers to all questions. And no, I mean, just like everybody else, he and the bishops together have to do their homework and study a question and ask for advice by competent people and read the Gospels and reflect on how this stands in harmony with our long tradition of interpreting the gospel. So so the whole style of church governance and the style of the papacy is moving away from a more pyramidal monarchical model to one that's much more collaborative and collegial. And that's a good thing. There were there were bishops at the Second Vatican Council who were afraid that by speaking of the collegial nature of the office of the bishops, that this would diminish the authority of the Bishop of Rome, that this would weaken the authority of the popes. I think the opposite has
Mm.
happened. I think this has, in a sense, um, the popes will make better decisions and their decisions will be received more effectively when there is this collaborative dynamic at work. And that's what we're seeing here. And this is again we're trying to also find a balance between the Pope's role as the, if you want, the presider or the um, yeah, the pastor of this big communion of local churches and the life of the local churches themselves. So the question is, are there some decisions that have to be reserved to the Bishop of Rome only, and other questions and decisions that need to be dealt with by the conferences of bishops or individual bishops in their diocese? All of that stuff is kind of in flux right now.
Mm. I'm just thinking about ordinary people in parishes sort of saying, well, isn't this all just a bit technical? Like, what does that really have to do with me? Um, but and I wonder what your response would be to that. But I wonder if it is something around style, it's around forms of decision making, it's around how how we express our community. What would you say for sort of just ordinary people in the pews? What does it matter to me what the what the Pope does or doesn't do?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways, um, John O'Malley, an American Jesuit, has written about this, and he said, until the 19th century, it didn't matter to most Catholics who the Pope was because they never saw him and they never heard from him. But in our day, we have instantaneous communication,
Mm.
and we might know even before my bishop what was said in Rome this afternoon, and be thinking about how this affects us. And in some ways, that might give us a false notion and like an exaggerated devotion to the person of the Pope, which is also not entirely helpful.
Mm.
But I think getting this right is important because it has to do with the nature of the church. There's my geeky hat again from being a teacher of ecclesiology. But recovering at the Second Vatican Council a proper understanding of the role of my bishop as a pastor of a local community with a lot of responsibility. And to understand, my bishop is not the manager of a branch plant who's waiting for orders from the head office in Rome, but he's really the pastor and the leader here. And and that all of us as members of this local community, parishioners, professional people, farmers, We all have experience that can contribute to the reflections of our pastors on important matters, and the kind of witness we want to give as a Christian community in this place. So getting the balance right is really important. And in a sense, if we don't have it correct, the effect of it is completely to disempower the bishop in the local church. Or if we don't understand the co-responsibility of the lay people, we also disempower them.
Mm.
And we fail to understand the energy and the vitality of the church is there in the baptized, who are the principal presence of the church in the world and the primary witnesses to the gospel in the world all week long. So getting all of those things in the proper place is really important, and understanding the dynamic interaction between them all.
And actually, you're reminding me of way back earlier in the document where it says, I think it's 28, synodality is spiritual renewal and structural reform. And so actually, this chapter is taking that seriously. It's taking it seriously right the way through to the person of the Pope.
Right. And all of these organizational structures will always be in flux because we live in a changing world and changing cultures, and it's appropriate for us to be adapting them to meet the needs of a different time.
Mm. Thank you so much. We're kind of coming to the end of our time now, but I just want to ask you, what do you have a favorite line or phrase from this section or from the document more widely that you'd like to share?
Oh gosh, there's so many. Um, I think some of the most important lines early on in the document that talks about the importance of baptism. That baptism is the foundation of synodality. It's the root of it all. And um, elsewhere, it's early also. It's in about number 32, 33. Um, they quote Pope Francis where he says, synodality is also the interpretive key to understanding ministry.
Mm.
So, so there's all of these relationships that we're talking about, the relationships between um, the baptized Christian faithful and ordained ministers, lay ministers and ordained ministers, um, bishops, bishops among themselves, bishops with the Bishop of Rome. All of these relationships exist to support the baptized and enable them to be good Christians and to be good living witnesses to the gospel every day. To enable, we live in community to support each other and enable one another to be living witnesses to the gospel. That's in a sense the purpose of all of these structures and practices. And we're looking for ways to do that better, but in these practices of synodality. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for awakening the the sense of the dignity and the weight of our baptismal vocation for all members of the church.
Thank you so much, Cathy. You've steered us safely through Geeky Week. We've now got a different understanding of the global church. I think that's one of the really lovely things about this is that it sort of lifts our imagination out of our little parish communities or our Catholic communities wherever we are, and gives us that sense of the connections across the world. But also how our church works. It's really important that as lay people we understand how decisions are made, where decisions are made, who's making them. So thank you so much. And then right at the end, you brought it all back, that it's for the mission of the church, is not for some abstract, random notion of church one way or another. It's for the mission. It's for all of us to live that out in our world. So thank you so much. It's been really, really fascinating.
Thanks, Avril. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So, everybody, how are you doing? I feel like I've been breathing the heady air of a very tall mountain or something like that. Listening back to that with Cathy, I think there's just so much richness, and I suspect there's so much that even people who know the Vatican pretty well will have found something new to reflect on this evening. So, at this point, I'm going to ask Matthew to join me again. Father Matthew, in the Archdiocese of Liverpool, not only was he the co-moderator of their synod, Matthew, you're a trustee. You're on the Archbishop's Advisory Committee. You've had all sorts of jobs in the diocese. So actually, you kind of get to see the geeky end of a diocese from the inside out as well. You're part of your Archdiocesan Synodal Council as well. So kind of and as a parish priest have spent years trying to enable these structures to flourish in your own communities as well. So I'm going to say to everybody, if you're watching this live, please drop us a question, please drop us a comment. We've seen some really great ones coming in, but I'm going to go to Matthew. Just give us your reaction. What really stood out for you from what you just heard?
I thought it was wonderful. Cathy sort of like focused in on all sorts of different issues, but I mean, one of the big phrases that really sort of grabbed my attention was this idea of exchange of gifts. That there's something quite powerful which I found really challenging about our whole disposition, how we are in the world, how we view each other, and it really surfaces questions about curiosity. Are we actually curious about what is the gift that's out there that's waiting to be unearthed or found or discovered each other? And what's the gift in me, I suppose, that's waiting to be brought out and to be shared somewhere else? And I think Cathy sort of focused in on that by, well, I found a really challenging sort of phrase that she used was saying, is that invitation to pay attention to what's happening elsewhere. And because I think, I don't know, there's something perhaps that there's something about we all can have a tendency just to focus on what we know, what we're familiar with, and we patrol those boundaries quite carefully. And at the heart of, certainly at the heart of this chapter and the heart of synodality, I think, is that invitation to be curious about what's going on just over there, and just out of sight, which may be a very different experience of what I'm living through. But there might be a gift that might unlock something or some insight that just might shift something in a way that I would is totally unexpected. And I think certainly in terms of like parishes and our experience of parishes, I don't know, certainly we've had a notion of the fortress parish from years ago where those boundaries were really well patrolled. It wasn't the thing to set foot in a neighbouring parish church or anything like that. You just didn't do that. And that, so there's all those sort of things that have been deeply ingrained, but actually there's a curiosity we need to discover, because the whole culture is shifting, isn't it? And Cathy was talking about the sense of belonging that people have, how people connect, that there's all sorts of different ways that people connect in the whole digital world. We're connecting, aren't we? Like me and you, Avril, physically on Zoom. We're miles apart. You're down south, I'm up in Liverpool, but we've got people from Fiji and from America and from all over the place who are present with us, connecting this evening electronically. So the whole digital nature is shifting the ground. And what are the implications then in terms of like how we belong? And the tectonic plates are shifting. And I don't, as Cathy, when you it was interesting, you pressed Cathy, so what does that mean for when we think about parishes? And she didn't have an immediate answer, which I thought, well, that's really good, actually. That's really, really good, because it's something to be scratching away at, isn't it? All these issues of what does it mean to be parish now, in a way where everything is shifting around. People are connecting in, people are driving miles to connect and travelling through X number of other parishes to connect in there because of something or other. So I thought there's all sorts of things. What about for you, Avril?
There's so much richness. I mean, I'm picking up in the comments a couple of things that I just want to bring together, and they maybe seem quite different. But Mary Foster T speaks about a kind of raising of critical consciousness, which has come from, I think, liberation theology, Paulo Freire, and that understanding of how are we church? What does that look like? But I also then want to relate that to Blanca's comment about a community of communities. And what I was really reminded, and I was just looking back through the document because I can't remember if it actually made it into the final version of the document. But in the reflections that Timothy Radcliffe gave us at the beginning, the retreat on the Easter appearances of Jesus after his resurrection, he reflected a lot on the fishing, where Peter goes out and they catch nothing all night, and then they drag the net in. And at one point, Timothy Radcliffe, and if people are curious, you can get the talks are on our website and they're elsewhere on the internet. They're really, really worth reflecting on. But Timothy Radcliffe speaks about the net is made of space and rope together. And he says that if you don't have one, or if you have no rope, you have no net. But if you have no space, you also have no net. Like, it just doesn't function to pull the fish in. And he was saying that the links in the net were the bonds between the local churches on all sorts of different levels. And actually, the bishops around my table loved that idea. They loved the idea that we were bonded, we were linked in this way, which gave each little local community a kind of degree of freedom and movement. It's distinctive, but actually that as the net of the church, we were linked around the world. And as you said, I am just looking at, where we're seeing people coming from. I can see Broken Bay in Australia and Villanova in America, and lots of people in the UK. And so we are bonded, like the links in the net to be given. And it does need the church structure. Otherwise, it would just fall apart. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't, if we didn't have all these layers of authority. And sometimes they're problematic, but often they're problematic. But we're on the journey. I was also very interested that she said that a whole load of other churches are on the same journey as us, and we are not alone in this. That I thought was really fascinating. I don't know about you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and because the whole ecumenical element that Cathy spoke of, how again it is that fundamental curiosity, isn't it? In being interested in the gift that we are to each other. Well, they're just doing their own thing. We're not really interested. There's a richness in that conversation, in the exchange of gifts, but whether it's ecumenically, and then the whole element of the Eastern churches, which I think was picked up in the some of the comments, the questions there as well, which I think is fascinating. That I think one of your questions, Avril, that you brought out in talking with Cathy, was that issue of people who've come from other countries, other cultures, and have migrants who've arrived. And what does it mean? What's their sense of belonging and connection with their own tradition from wherever they've originated from? But what's the implication then in terms of, like, locally? What's the gift that can be brought to each other in those sort of local contexts, and how are those conversations nurtured, rather than just, we'll just all have lots of little bubbles of our own thing, and not actually be interested in each other. Yeah.
It was really interesting to see Philip Jude Fernandez in the comments there talking about the Federation of Asian Bishops Conferences, which is I'm growing daily in my respect for the FABC, the stuff that they seem to be able to do together. But they've had an ongoing concern for immigration and how the kind of receiving and the sending parishes. And actually, Cardinal Michael Zerny, who's head of the dicastery for, I'm going to get the name of this wrong, human development. I'm so
Integral
rubbish
human
on
development.
Vatican structures.
Yeah.
But anyway, the bit of the Vatican that has a concern for immigration had just managed to get agreement from the bishops' conferences. And I think I might have said this in a previous one or in a talk I've done this week. It's all blending into one now. But that all the bishops' conferences from Colombia all the way up to Canada on this Western route had the same treatment of immigrants. And so there was that notion of connecting up the links in the chain, as it were, or, that beautiful description of parish as home. Parish as home is not just for the people who've been brought up their children there, forever and ever. How is it parish as home for people who've been in the country for 5 minutes and who've left for whatever reasons? How is it home for our kids who are asking lots of questions? How is it home in so many different ways? And I think that for me is kind of where I'm really going back to. I think we better had finish in a minute because this has been just such a rich conversation, but I want to pick up Phyllis Sagano's comment and question about, does the principle of subsidiarity apply? Can Africa really make its own determinations about polygamy? And I think we probably do just need to mention that there are these study groups that are picking up some of the really knotty issues that emerged from the first assembly. They're supposed to be meeting, there's 10 of them, and they are looking at everything from how do we do synodality with the poor and the marginalized across the world, to the role of the bishop, the role of the nuncio, complex moral questions such as our theological approach to the LGBTQ community. They're all meeting. They're all reporting sometime in June. That was so look out for that coming, because that's going to be a big old splash when it hits the Catholic press. But the other two things that will be reporting around the same time are the Canonical Commission, which is looking at the canon law implications. At various points in this document, it says we request a change to canon law. And so the Canonical Commission are looking at the actual changes to the Code of Canon Law. And then the second one of those is the Polygamy Commission. And that, to my memory, that was headed up, and it was entirely African bishops and theologians, from what I can remember. And the idea is that they would come up with the pastoral response. And I mean, obviously, everything has to be presented back to the Pope, but that they would then be developing the pastoral response to polygamy on behalf of the wider church. So we will see. It's so live. It's all still in the process of changing. And although we think that we were kind of done with synodality about 3 years ago, actually, we've got years and years of working this out as to how we go forward. Phyllis is saying perhaps not until December. I think she's probably on an inside track, actually, given Phyllis, for those who don't know her, is one of the people who was on the study group about women deacons. So, Phyllis, I am actually quite starstruck that you're putting comments in this evening, because that's quite amazing to know that you're on the call with us. And I suspect that she probably knows far more than I do about how these Vatican study groups are reporting back. So maybe I think probably Pope Leo needs a minute or two. As he said the other day, I'm so new in my job, I need to get, and to have all of that landing on his desk within a month or two of him becoming Pope would be pretty hard going. Thank you so much to everybody this evening. Gosh, even Geeky Week is totally fascinating. So I hope that that you have stuck with us. I love the questions. We always love the questions. And we also really love hearing from you. So if we get comments and questions and thoughts coming in on email to us. So if you want to, get in touch, say what you're doing, or share something which you've thought of, we just love that too. It's really fantastic. This, I think, the bit of the church that we looked at this week is a bit that people rarely get to see. But it does, as Cathy says, it shapes the church we are, the kind of authority that the kind of hierarchy of the church has impacts us in our parishes and impacts our understanding of ourselves. So really fantastic to have had the opportunity to share that, unpack that a bit, and as Mary said, to raise our critical consciousness a bit, and perhaps send people diving off into other places to kind of go and examine that a bit further. Next week, I can't believe we're in week 4 already. Next week, we reach the 5th chapter of the document, Forming a People for Missionary Discipleship on Formation. And I'm delighted. And for the next 2 weeks, we will be live. So you'll be able to, I know last week people wanted to know some of the ends of the stories and things that Estella chose, and we didn't have her on with us. But next 2 weeks, we will be live. And I'm being joined by 2 friends and fellow facilitators from the Assembly to explore the implications of synodality for formation, and in particular what synodal leadership might look like. This is Father David McCallum and Sandra Chul, who are part of the team behind the Discerning Leadership Programme in the Vatican, training potential bishops, senior religious and lay people in leading Catholic communities. So it will be fantastic. And Sandra is from the Middle East, and Father David is from America. So we're kind of clocking up our continents as well as we go, this wonderful picture of the global church. And we cannot believe how many people have been engaging with our webinar series so far. So we have decided that you just might like to be able to talk to each other a bit. So a fortnight after our final exploration, our final chapter, we are putting on an extra chapter, a live Zoom event on Wednesday, the 9th of July, 7:30 till 9. Same time we've been meeting, but a fortnight out. And we hope that lots of you will join us to share what's inspired and challenged you, get the opportunity to speak in small groups with each other, and to share with us what you'd like to see coming next, and what might support you as you take next steps on your synodal journey. In the meantime, you can find lots of resources on practicing synodality on our website, including the sign-ups for our next round of facilitator training starting in July. Do share this webinar with anyone you think would be interested, and we'll see you again next time. God bless and goodbye.